year. I want to just start off with you. We got a lot of fun things to get to here by talking about big picture on the Vikings offseason as we march closer, only a few days away, really, from Vikings training camp. It's about 2 weeks away. And I've started making all of my lists over the weekend. And this is the thing. People usually on July 4th go to fireworks shows. They do fun things with family members. They barbecue. I was making training camp lists of the most interesting players, the rookies to watch, all those different things, the guys who are on the fringe who could make the rosters. So I had a better time than you did. But I want to kind of bring it back a little bit, though, to look at this offseason in the bigger picture. Because once the moves happen in a bubble, we analyze them. Okay, they drafted these players. Let's analyze that. They signed this player. Let's analyze that. And then we get to the end where no more moves are being made. And we're like, okay, we'll talk about it later then. But since we've got plenty of time here on Purple Daily, let's discuss this. And the way that I'd like to do it is to go back to the final moment of the NFL season when the Rams kick a field goal and miss and lose the Super Bowl. Right? Didn't they kick a field goal on the final play and miss, even though they had already lost?
Brady kneeled down, so all the bettors in Las Vegas could get the Brady over 1.5 carries spot.
But the play before that was a missed field goal, right?
Like, yeah, that's right. They were trying to cut the lead from 10 to 7 and then do the onside kick thing. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so anyway, when Brady kneels down and it's all over, and we think about what our offseason plan was for the Minnesota Vikings versus how it turned out, I think it was very different in my mind at that moment from how it ultimately turned out, how I would have laid it out myself. But if I were predicting it, I would have predicted it to go very much like this, to bring back all the defensive players and so forth. So if we had gone back to that moment and talked about how you would have designed the Vikings offseason, where would you have started? Like what would have been your priority list at that moment when you knew the players that could potentially go, you knew the potential free agents and all of those things?
Well, I think the offseason presented an opportunity for the Vikings to make some tough decisions, right? Because there were issues with, defensively, where you're going to bring back Anthony Barr. At cornerback, where you're going to try to get younger. On the offensive line, same thing, right? Riley Reif, so on and so forth. Obviously, you had Cousins there, but I think the 8-7-1 season sort of like shined a light on a lot of their issues. And really what they did, and as you said, it was somewhat predictable, is they sort of kicked a lot of those decisions down the road, right? Riley Reif is still their left tackle. Anthony Barr is now, has a big contract and he's playing inside linebacker. Kyle Rudolph is back to being their tight end. And Xavier Rhodes, despite a down season, is still their cornerback, their top cornerback. So, you were talking about Antonio Brown as a possibility for them as their to anywhere.
It has been a while since there has been football, hasn't it?
But
when was I talking about Antonio Brown? What month was that?
It was January or February.
January?
Yeah, he was going through his ordeal with the Steelers that seemingly took forever. But
do you believe how long the offseason is? That was 6 or 7 months ago that people were subtweeting me about Antonio Brown and yelling at me for suggesting that they have 3 good wide receivers, as if that had ever worked in Minnesota before.
But you look at the way the roster is constructed now. What is that much different than the season ago? I mean, except for expectations. Last season we came in, the expectations were far higher. But really, this roster is a pretty good defense with some offensive talent, a limited quarterback, and no cap space. Like that's exactly the same thing as they had a season ago. So it's predictable, right? Because that's what they're comfortable with, but it was not necessarily this collection of difficult decisions that I think you and I both wanted them to make.
So it's pretty clear to me that the Vikings thought going into the offseason, their thought process was very different from ours, where they looked at what happened last year and they said, here's what Kirk Cousins really needs. He needs clearly a couple of more offensive linemen. I think the entire nation would agree that Kirk Cousins needed a couple of more offensive linemen. Maybe another weapon. And what he really needs, though, is a better scheme. He needs Kevin Stefanski. He needs Gary Kubiak in here. He needs to run a similar version of the offense that he had when he played for Sean McVay in Washington. Now, of course, that brings you to the natural question, why didn't you think of this last year? Right? I mean, when you were hiring John DeFilippo, why didn't you look for someone who had a Shanahan or a McVay style offense to run Kirk Cousins with because that's what he had his most success with in Washington. But putting that aside, it's very clear that their conclusion was we should have won more last year if only Kirk Cousins had X, Y, and Z. And I guess I can see that because when you go through it with a fine tooth comb, you find missed field goals, you find an inordinate number of fumbles that got recovered by the other team and potentially run back for a touchdown. You find some pick sixes, things that are just randomness, really. And then, some injuries and stuff on the defensive side, a very surprising and unorthodox performance by a team in LA where the offense was actually going pretty well. And you just lose that game in part because shockingly your defense melts down. And I really mean like totally shockingly. It's only the second time I think since I've covered the team where the defense had a complete meltdown, the other being
Colts. 2016.
Well, I was thinking the NFC Championship game. So that's, I guess, the third time.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot about that.
Three times in 3 years, your defense has melted down completely, and it just happened to be that time. So I understand the thought process. You brought Mike Zimmer here to win with defense. So why would you say, all right, actually, we're going to strip you of a bunch of your defensive talent so we can now get Jawan James or something, right? I mean, I can see where they would look at that and go, I don't really think that makes a lot of sense. We just need to do more around Kirk Cousins. But had it been me, I would have said, this win with defense thing, sometimes it works. Yes, you got to the NFC Championship game in a year with a bizarre number of injuries at the quarterback position and a shocking drop in quarterback play in 2017 that opened the door for you, especially with your schedule, to be the number one defense in the NFL and get to the NFC Championship game on a literal miracle is how you got there. Actually, you got beat by Drew Brees and then had a miracle play that got you there. So the idea that you can just win with defense, it happens every once in a while in the NFL that someone gets to the Super Bowl that way. And yes, in the actual Super Bowl, it's great to have a great defense that can shut down Jared Goff, and that's a good way to win. But building it around and investing this much money in defensive talent would not have been the way I would have gone. For me, it would have been, we're going to go all in on Kirk Cousins. We paid the man all this money. We brought him here, and we're going to do everything we can to support him. And if he fails, that's because of him. That's not because of what we did. That's because he just didn't play well enough. And one of the things that really struck me, Eric, is when I looked at the amount of cap space positionally that the Vikings were spending, it's incredible that they're not one of the highest spending teams on offense, but they are on defense. They have one of the biggest quarterback contracts, but they're not one of the highest spending teams on offense this year. I just, that wouldn't be that way if I had redone the offseason. I think I would have done it quite a bit differently.
Well, and I would even append to that I would have done it more on the perimeter than on the interior, right? We know that pressure rate is very much a quarterback dependent thing, a scheme dependent thing. And what you really can't account for now in the NFL is the lack of talent on the outside. We know that Diggs and Thielen are great, but they've really not had an explosive third option in forever. And there were plenty of opportunities there. You said Golden Tate, there are tight ends like Jared Cook, but they're also like Adam Humphries was a terrific, he was worth half a win last season for Tampa Bay as their fourth receiver. There was tons of talent there. I sort of think about it as like you look at baseball, right? And the Twins were like this forever. They had a terrible starting staff, right? And they always made the argument, well, you can't really sign a starting pitcher because you're going to get Urban Santana for $15 million a year. He's going to be average. That's kind of how offensive line is. If you want to sign, the best guard in free agency, it's Roger Saffold, who none of us have heard of until last season right. when the Vikings couldn't block anybody, right? So if you want to, you're better off. You're going to get more bang for your buck generating talent and value on the outside, and then scheming protection, making sure Kirk handles pressure better. The offensive line thing, like you're going to get Josh Klein, frankly, right? That's that's when you try to shore up the offensive line. I do think picking Bradbury, I mean, he's probably, he wasn't our best center. He wasn't a first round pick in our opinion. It was probably a blunder relative to taking a tackle, which is a more valuable position. But ultimately, I think where they really erred is the only offensive talent they added to the team was a backup running back and a backup tight end in the draft.
So that's an interesting point about the approach to the draft, because in my mind initially went to sort of the free agency route. And even though your point is valid about Roger Saffold, still having an average or slightly above average guard there at that position if you've got the money to spend. And the Wilfs have got the money to spend, and they can always find ways to
Yeah.
finagle the cap to get those guys. So if you get Roger Saffold, you go from having one of the worst guard situations in the entire NFL to then assuming that, you draft the center and then move Elfline to guard, where I think he's going to be better. And at very least, I think Elfline's going to be better than Tom Compton was. But you go from having one of the worst guard situations to an average one potentially, which is I don't know if I've ever used this in football before. I'm going to have to come up with a football person to use. But in baseball, I always use Gregor Blanco. You ever heard of Gregor
Yes.
Blanco? Like Gregor Blanco won, I think, 3 World Series as a starting outfielder with the San Francisco Giants. And everyone like, what, Gregor Blanco? Who? But the guy would hit 270 with 12 home runs and play plus defense in the outfield and bat ninth or eighth. And so it'd be like, okay, well, your eighth hitter hits 270 with 10 home runs and catches everything in the outfield. If that guy, a lot of teams will have star talent, but they'll have some player in left field who's a below replacement level player, and that hurts you a lot. I think the impact of going from way below replacement like Tom Compton, or I guess by the actual definition, a replacement level player Tom Compton, to an average one is the same jump as average to elite.
I think it's more actually. I think, when you go from, so in Vikings, parlance, you go from TJ Clemmings to Riley Reef is a way bigger jump than going from Riley Reef to Tyron Smith, right? Because almost every single tackle is overmatched physically by the person in front of them. They're going to give up pressure, but it's the person that gives up pressure on 15% of their snaps instead of 10 that's really going to drain you. But I do agree with that. The only issue is the Vikings, it was never in the Vikings like sort of worldview to act this way. They were never not going to put money into the defense. They were never not going to get rid of the sort of the folks that would have been difficult to get rid of. And so in that realm, they were never going to afford Roger Saffold, right? So that's the hard part. And so at the same time, they could have afforded like Adam Humphries,